She stood at the edge of the ballroom like a ghost someone had forgotten to bury. The chandeliers burned above her, dripping honey-colored light onto silk gowns and glittering jewels, but none of it touched Seraphina Langley, the Duchess of Ashbourne. She wore a gown the color of pale champagne, elegant and modest, chosen because she still wanted him to notice. She had let her maid pin her dark hair up with pearl combs, had pressed her lips together until they pinkened, and had told herself that tonight might be different. It was not different. Her husband, Lucian Ashbourne, the Duke of Ashbourne, passed her without a glance, not a flicker of acknowledgement, not the barest nod. He walked past her as though she were a pillar, part of the architecture, and extended his hand to Lady Marguerite Pemberton, who smiled as if she had won a prize. Seraphina's chest tightened, but she did not move. She watched Lucian lead Lady Marguerite onto the floor. The music swelled. They danced with an ease that spoke of history, of familiarity, of something Seraphina had never been given. Her husband's head tilted down to catch whatever Lady Marguerite was saying, and the corner of his mouth lifted just barely, but it was more than Seraphina had ever received. The whispers began, soft as moth wings against her ears. His Grace hasn't looked at his own wife all evening. They say it was a forced marriage, you know, some old family debt. Poor thing, standing there watching him with Lady Marguerite, it's cruel. Seraphina felt every word like a needle slipping beneath her skin. Her gloved fingers tightened around the stem of her untouched champagne glass. She did not drink. She did not cry. She simply stood, because to leave would be to admit that the whispers were true, and some stubborn part of her still believed that if she stayed quiet and patient and good, he might eventually turn around. The dance ended. Lucian escorted Lady Marguerite back to her circle, his hand resting briefly at her elbow. He still did not look at his wife. Seraphina waited until the attention shifted, until the crowd's hungry eyes moved to the next scandal, and then she slipped away into the corridor. The marble hall was cold and empty. Her footsteps echoed. She pressed a hand to her stomach and breathed through the ache, reminding herself that she had endured worse. 3 years of this. 3 years of silence, of separate bedrooms, of politeness so brittle it could shatter at a single honest word. And still, she had woken this morning and thought, tonight he might see me. He never did. That was the night Seraphina stopped hopping. The marriage had been arranged when she was 20, the daughter of the late Viscount Langley, a man whose name had once commanded respect. Her father had served in the war alongside the previous Duke of Ashbourne, Lucian's grandfather, and when the Viscount's ship was lost at sea, the old Duke had made a provision in his will. Lucian would marry Seraphina Langley, or forfeit a significant portion of the Ashbourne inheritance. Seraphina had not known this until much later. She had been told only that the Duke of Ashbourne wished to honor her father's memory by offering his protection. She had arrived at Ashbourne Hall with a trunk full of hope and a heart ready to love. Lucian had looked at her once coldly and said, "You will have every comfort. Do not expect more." She had smiled and nodded because she had been raised to be agreeable, and she assumed that affection would bloom if she simply tried hard enough. She had learned his preferences, his routines, the way he took his tea and the authors he admired. She had dressed with care, spoken gently, never complained. She had loved him quietly and desperately in ways he never cared to see. And for 3 years, he had kept her at arm's length. The morning after the ball, Seraphina sat at the breakfast table, a silver tray untouched before her. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows of the morning room, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Lucian entered, already dressed for riding, his dark hair swept back, his jaw clean-shaven and sharp enough to cut glass. He did not greet her. He merely walked to the sideboard, selected a piece of toast, and sat at the opposite end of the long table, unfolding the morning paper. Seraphina watched him, her heart thudding dully. A month ago she would have tried to speak, to fill the silence with some small observation about the weather or the gardens. Today, Something had shifted. She felt hollowed out, as if the humiliation of the ballroom had scraped away the last of her tender hope. She said nothing. The silence stretched. Lucian turned a page. Finally, without looking up, he said, "You left early last evening." Serafina's breath caught. He had noticed. That single small acknowledgment sent a traitorous flicker through her chest, but she crushed it. She would not be that desperate again. "I was tired," she said, her voice even. He gave a small hum, the kind one gives a servant, and turned back to his paper. Serafina stood quietly and left the room. He did not watch her go. The days that followed marked a quiet transformation. Serafina stopped arranging the dinner menu around Lucian's preferences. She stopped waiting in the drawing room in case he wished to speak with her. She stopped hovering near the entryway when she heard his horse on the drive. Instead, she walked. The grounds of Ashbourne Hall stretched for miles, gardens, woodlands, tenant farms that had fallen into neglect. The estate had been managed by stewards and solicitors for years, but Lucian, consumed by his own affairs, had never truly attended to it. The tenants were loyal but struggling. The gardens had once been famous for their roses, but now the trellises sagged and the pathways were choked with weeds. Serafina started small. She visited the gardener, an elderly man named Mr. Finch, and asked if she might help. He looked startled, but he did not refuse a duchess. She traded her silk slippers for sturdy boots and began to work alongside him, digging, pruning, learning. The earth was cool and honest beneath her fingers. It did not judge her. It did not look past her. The first time a tenant's wife, Mrs. Darby, fell ill, Serafina arrived at the cottage with broth and medicine. She did not send a servant. She went herself. Word spread quietly among the village that the young duchess had a gentle hand and a listening ear. Soon she was welcomed into homes, offered chipped cups of tea, told stories of leaky roofs and struggling harvests. She listened. She wrote careful notes. She used a portion of her own allowance to have a roof repaired, a well cleaned, a load of seed delivered. She did it all silently, without expectation of gratitude, and certainly without telling Lucian. He would not have been interested anyway. And slowly, imperceptibly, something inside her began to heal, not completely. The ache was still there, buried beneath the surface, but she no longer lay awake at night waiting for a door to open that never would. She began to sleep. She began to eat. She began, for the first time in 3 years, to live for herself. The Duke of Ashbourne noticed the change in his household before he noticed the change in his wife. It began with the morning breakfast. For nearly 1,000 mornings, Serafina had been there, seated at the long table, a quiet presence he had grown accustomed to ignoring. Then, one morning, the chair was empty. He paused at the threshold of the morning room, his newspaper in hand, and found only the silent sideboard and the faint scent of lavender, her scent, lingering like a memory. He sat down. He waited. The toast grew cold. She did not come. The next morning she was absent again, and the next. When he inquired, his valet, Mr. Simmons, said simply, "Her Grace has been visiting the tenants, Your Grace. She often leaves early." Lucian frowned. "The tenants?" "Yes, Your Grace. She has been quite involved in their welfare. The village speaks very highly of her." He did not know how to feel about that. He set down his paper with more force than necessary. It was not that he wanted her at breakfast. It was simply that her absence was a disruption, a deviation from the order of things. He began to notice other small deviations. The roses in the east garden, which had been a tangle of brown thorns, were suddenly blooming. The cook mentioned that the Duchess had asked for simpler meals, less waste. A footman, thinking he was unobserved, smiled warmly when Serafina passed him in the corridor. Not the polite, strained smile servants gave their masters, but genuine affection. It unsettled Lucian more than he cared to admit. One evening, he was reviewing ledgers in his study when a knock came at the door. It was his steward, Mr. Hartley, an efficient man with sharp eyes. "Your Grace, I thought you should know," Hartley said, laying a paper on the desk. "The Duchess has been purchasing supplies for several of the tenant farms. Seeds, a plow blade, roofing materials. She used her personal funds." Lucian stared at the paper. The list was long and practical, the handwriting neat. Seraphina's handwriting. He had never seen it before. "Why was I not informed?" he asked, his voice cooler than he intended. "Her Grace requested that it not trouble you, Your Grace. She said it was her duty to help, and that she did not wish to burden you with small matters." Her duty. The phrase echoed in his mind. For 3 years his wife had been a silent, almost invisible presence, fulfilling what he had assumed was her obligation to endure a loveless marriage. And now she had found another duty, one that did not involve him at all. Something hot and unfamiliar coiled in his chest. He pushed the ledger away. "Leave it," he said. Hartley bowed and withdrew. Lucian sat alone in the lamplight, tapping one finger against the polished wood. He told himself he was merely curious, that a duke must be aware of what occurred on his own estate. But when he closed his eyes, he saw Seraphina's face as it had been at the ball, pale, composed, but with something shattered behind her eyes. He had not realized it then. He had been too focused on ignoring her. He wondered, for the first time, what she had felt in that moment. He dismissed the thought quickly. It was not his concern. She was his wife in name, a condition of an unwanted inheritance. That was all. But the next morning, when he passed the breakfast room and found her chair empty once more, the house seemed quieter than before. The first crack in his armor appeared on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon. Lucian had been riding the boundaries of the estate, checking on the condition of the hedgerows, when he came upon a scene he did not expect. In the meadow near the eastern wood, Seraphina stood among a cluster of women and children from the tenant families. She wore a simple blue dress, the hem dark with dew, her hair pinned loosely at the nape of her neck. She was laughing at something a small boy had said, her whole face alight with a warmth Lucian had never seen directed at him. Beside her stood a man he did not recognize. Young, perhaps a few years older than Seraphina, with sandy hair and a relaxed, easy posture. He carried a leather satchel and a notebook, and he was looking at Seraphina with an expression that Lucian knew too well. Interest. Admiration. The kind of look a man gave a woman he found entirely captivating. Lucian's hands tightened on the reins. His horse shifted beneath him, sensing the change. The stranger said something that made Seraphina laugh again, a sound that floated across the meadow like a ribbon of silk. She touched the man's sleeve, a brief, casual gesture of familiarity, and Lucian felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. He had no right to feel this. He knew that. He had ignored her for 3 years. He had practically built a wall between them brick by brick. But watching her shine for someone else, watching her give her smiles and her warmth to strangers and that unknown man, ignited something feral in his chest. He rode closer, deliberately allowing his horse's hooves to sound against the earth. The group looked up. The children's faces flickered with awe and nervousness. The women curtsied. Seraphina's smile faded the instant she saw him, replaced by a calm, neutral mask. The sudden extinguishing of her joy felt like a slap. "Your Grace," she said, inclining her head, "we did not expect you." "Clearly," he said, his voice cold. He dismounted with fluid grace, his boots sinking into the soft grass, his gaze fixed on the sandy-haired man. "And you are?" The man bowed, entirely unruffled. "Julian Emery, Your Grace, a botanist. Her Grace was kind enough to allow me to study the native flora here. She has done remarkable work restoring the gardens." Lucian's eyes flicked to Seraphina. "I was not aware you had engaged a botanist." She met his gaze without flinching. "You never asked." The silence that followed was sharp and strained. The women and children had stopped their chatter, sensing the tension. Seraphina held his stare for a moment longer, then turned back to the group, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Darby, I will bring the salve for your son's cough this evening, and Mr. Emery has agreed to help plant the new hedge tomorrow. If you need anything else, please send word." The tenants murmured their thanks and began to disperse, casting uneasy glances at the Duke. Mr. Emery lingered a moment longer, his expression mild but watchful. "Your Grace," he said with a small bow, and then he walked away, falling into step beside Seraphina as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lucian stood alone in the meadow, the ghost of his wife's distant smile burning behind his eyes. That evening he sought her out. It was a thing he had never done before. He found her in the small sitting room she had claimed for herself, a room he had not entered since the first week of their marriage. She was seated by the window, a letter in her hand, her profile outlined by the fading sunset. She did not look up when he entered. "Seraphina," he said. Her name felt strange on his tongue, heavy and unfamiliar. He had called her Duchess, or more often, nothing at all. She folded the letter slowly, her movements unhurried, and finally lifted her eyes to his. Yes. He had no clear reason for being there. He had rehearsed nothing. The question that had burned in his chest since the meadow was not a rational one, and he resented it. "Who is Julian Emery to you?" Seraphina's expression did not change. "He is a botanist, as I said." "You were very familiar with him." A shadow of something, surprise perhaps, or disbelief, crossed her face. "He has been kind to me. He shares an interest in the gardens. I was not aware my acquaintances required your approval." The words were not defiant, merely tired. That tiredness stung more than anger would have. He stepped closer, his voice dropping. "You are the Duchess of Ashbourne. Your behavior reflects on this house." Something flickered in her eyes, the faintest spark of the fire he had never known she possessed. She rose from her chair, and though she was a head shorter than him, she did not seem small. "For 3 years," she said quietly, "my behavior has been flawless. I have attended your dinners, endured your silence, smiled at your guests, and asked for nothing. I have been invisible in your house, Lucian. Do not pretend you care now because someone else has noticed I exist." The words struck him like a physical blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came. She had never spoken to him like this before. She had never spoken at all, not truly. He saw, with painful clarity, that the quiet, hopeful girl who had arrived at Ashbourne Hall was gone, replaced by a woman who had stopped needing him. He should have felt relieved. He had wanted distance, had he not? But standing there, seeing the calm finality in her eyes, he felt only a vast, chilling emptiness. He left without another word. Over the following weeks, the distance between them grew into a chasm, but this time it was Seraphina who held the oars. She was never at breakfast. She was rarely at dinner. She filled her days with the tenants, the gardens, the endless small kindnesses that had made her beloved by everyone on the estate except her own husband. Lucian found himself listening for her footsteps, watching for the flash of her blue dress through the windows. He began to notice the way the housekeeper brightened when the Duchess was near, the way the footmen hurried to open doors for her, the way the entire estate seemed to breathe more easily when she walked its paths. He noticed, too, that Mr. Emery was a frequent visitor. The botanist came twice a week, sometimes more. He and Seraphina walked the gardens together, heads bent over notebooks, discussing soil and sunlight and root systems. Lucian observed them from the library window, his fingers drumming an agitated rhythm against the sill. He told himself he was merely keeping watch over his household. He told himself it was propriety. He knew it was a lie. One afternoon, his uncle, Sir Reginald Croft, arrived for an unscheduled visit. Sir Reginald was a lean, silver-haired man with a fox's smile, and he had been the executor of the late Duke's estate. He had always treated Seraphina with chilly politeness. "I see the Duchess has been keeping herself busy," Sir Reginald remarked, joining Lucian in the library. His eyes followed Seraphina and Mr. Emery as they crossed the lawn. "A very energetic young woman, but perhaps too familiar with the botanist. People will talk, Lucian. Lucian's voice was sharp. She is doing no harm. No, of course not, but you know how society is. A duchess must be above reproach, especially one whose marriage was, he paused delicately, unconventional. Lucian turned from the window, his expression granite. The marriage is perfectly conventional. Sir Reginald's smile was thin. If you say so, but I did warn you all those years ago that tying yourself to the Langley girl would bring complications. Her father's reputation was not entirely spotless. Lucian said nothing. His uncle's words, which once would have fed his resentment, now felt like an irritant, a burr beneath his skin. He had heard the same warnings before his marriage, that Viscount Langley had been a reckless gambler, that the old Duke had been deceived into the arrangement, that Seraphina's family had manipulated a dying man's gratitude. He had believed it all, had let it curdle inside him, had used it to justify his coldness. But now, watching Seraphina pause to help an elderly gardener lift a heavy pot, her hands caked with soil, her face soft with concern, he could not reconcile the woman he saw with the schemer his uncle had described. "I have been thinking," Lucian said slowly, "about my grandfather's will." Sir Reginald's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. "A tedious document. Why revisit it now?" "Because I never read it myself. You handled everything." "I handled it faithfully, as you know." There was a sharp edge to his uncle's voice now. Everything was done to protect the estate. Lucian studied him for a long moment, a seed of suspicion taking root. He said nothing more, but that night, after Sir Reginald had retired to his guest chamber, Lucian went to the old Duke's study, a room that had been locked since his grandfather's death. The key was in his possession. He had never used it. The study smelled of dust and aged paper. The heavy drapes had not been opened in years. Lucian lit a lamp and began searching through the cabinets, the shelves, the locked drawers. He did not know exactly what he was looking for. Perhaps he simply needed to prove to himself that his grandfather's wishes had been what his uncle claimed. He found the will at the bottom of an iron-bound chest, yellowed but legible. The legal language was dense, but he forced himself to read every line. The provision regarding his marriage was clear. If Lucian did not wed Seraphina Langley before his 25th birthday, the Ashbourne estate would pass into a trust controlled by a board of executors, with Sir Reginald Croft as the primary trustee. Lucian stared at the paper, his pulse a low drumbeat in his ears. It was not a punishment. It was not a trap set by the Langley family. It was a protection, a safeguard his grandfather had created because he had loved Seraphina's father like a brother, because the Viscount had saved his life at the Battle of Valmy, because the old Duke had wanted to ensure that the orphaned daughter of his dearest friend would be cared for, even after his death. There was no blackmail, no scheme, only an old soldier's honor and gratitude. And Sir Reginald had twisted it. Lucian's hands trembled as he read further, finding letters tied with a faded ribbon. Letters from the old Duke to Seraphina's father, full of affection and brotherhood. A letter written to Seraphina herself, never sent, in which his grandfather expressed his hope that Lucian would love her as she deserves, for she carries the best of her father's heart. He had married her believing she was a burden. He had treated her like a stranger, and all along she had been a gift he was too blind to see. The lamp flickered. Lucian sat in the darkness of his grandfather's study, and for the first time in years he wept. He did not go to her that night. He was a coward still, and he needed to understand the full scope of his uncle's deception. The next morning he confronted Sir Reginald in the library. The older man's composure cracked under Lucian's cold fury, and the truth spilled out in ugly fragments. Sir Reginald had coveted the Ashbourne fortune. When the old Duke's will demanded Lucian's marriage to Seraphina, Reginald had feared losing his influence. So he had poisoned Lucian's mind against her, spinning lies about the Langley family's supposed scheming. ensuring that Lucian would resent his wife and remain dependent on his uncle's guidance. He had hoped the marriage would remain cold, childless, and fragile, leaving him positioned to take control when things fell apart. "You will leave tonight," Lucian said, his voice like winter iron. "You will take nothing that is not yours. If I ever see you on this estate again, I will have you prosecuted for fraud." Sir Reginald blanched, but he did not argue. By evening he was gone. The knowledge of his own cruelty settled over Lucian like a shroud. He wandered the halls of Ashbourne Hall, seeing the emptiness his neglect had created. He thought of Seraphina's quiet patience, her unspoken hope, the way she had wilted under his indifference. He thought of her laughter in the meadow, laughter he had never caused. He thought of Mr. Emery, who had given her the simple respect Lucian had withheld. Fear, cold and relentless, gripped his heart. Not fear of scandal or loss of reputation, but fear of losing her. Because he knew now, with absolute certainty, that he loved her. He had loved her from the beginning, buried so deep under resentment that he had not recognized it, and he had spent 3 years killing whatever affection she might have felt for him. He had to tell her, he had to try. He found her in the rose garden, alone at last, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. She was seated on a stone bench, a basket of cut flowers at her feet, her face calm and unreadable. She looked up as he approached, and her expression did not warm. "Seraphina," he said, and his voice broke on her name. She waited. He knelt before her, not caring that the gravel pressed into his knees, not caring about dignity or pride. He was a duke, but before her he was only a man who had wronged her beyond measure. "I have been a fool," he said, "a blind, cruel fool. I believed lies about you, and I let those lies turn me into a man unworthy of your presence. But I know the truth now. I know who your father was and what my grandfather intended. And I know that you are not the burden I made you feel. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me, and I was too arrogant to see it." Her eyes widened, and for a moment her careful composure wavered. "You found the will." "I found everything. I know my uncle deceived me. It does not excuse what I did. Nothing excuses it. But I am begging you, Seraphina, I am begging you to give me a chance to undo even a fraction of the pain I have caused." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. She looked at him as though seeing him for the first time, this cold, distant duke on his knees in the dirt. "Do you know what I thought?" she whispered. "At the ball when you walked past me, I thought that I had finally become invisible, that after 3 years of trying I had simply ceased to exist in your world. I made a decision that night. I decided to stop existing for you." Her words were a blade, but he accepted the wound. "I know," he said. "I know I have no right, but I am asking anyway. Not as a duke, not as a husband who failed you, but as a man who has just discovered that he loves his wife and who is terrified it is too late." She was silent for a long, aching moment. The birdsong faded, the light dimmed. Then she reached out, very slowly, and touched his face. "It is too late for the woman I was," she said. "She is gone, but the woman I am now, she might be willing to learn who you truly are." Lucian closed his eyes, a shuddering breath escaping him. He pressed his lips to her palm, a gesture of gratitude and reverence, and did not speak for fear that his voice would fail. But the healing did not happen overnight. It could not. There were still silences between them, but they were different now, not silences of neglect, but of two people learning each other's rhythms. He walked with her to the tenants' cottages, carrying her baskets. He sat beside her in the garden while she worked the soil, asking questions about every plant, memorizing the names she loved. He listened, truly listened, as she described her childhood, her dreams, the quiet loneliness of her first years at Ashbourne Hall. He told her about his own loneliness, the pressure of the dukedom, the poison his uncle had dripped into his ear. He told her about the moment in the meadow when he had seen her with Mr. Emery and felt something shatter inside him. At the mention of the botanist, Seraphina smiled a real smile, the kind that reached her eyes. "Julian is my cousin," she said, "on my mother's side. He has been helping me plan an escape if I ever needed one. I had not yet decided whether to leave." Lucian's face drained of color. "Would you have gone?" She considered the question seriously. "I might have. I thought there was nothing for me here, but now," she looked at him, her gaze steady, "I think I will stay for now to see what grows." He took her hand, and he did not let go. Summer softened into autumn. The gardens blazed with color, and the tenants' harvest was the richest in a decade. Mr. Emery returned to London, leaving behind a carefully annotated map of the estate's flora and a quiet word to the Duke. "You hurt her," Julian said simply. "I hope you understand what you nearly lost." Lucian nodded. "I understand." "Good, then I trust you will spend the rest of your life proving it." He intended to. One evening, as the first chill of winter crept into the air, Lucian found Seraphina in the library, curled up in a chair with a book. She looked up when he entered, and the smile she gave him was no longer guarded. It was warm and it was real. "I have something for you," he said. He handed her a letter, yellowed with age, the seal still unbroken. It was the letter his grandfather had written to her, the one he had found in the study. She opened it with trembling fingers and read the words of a man who had believed in her, who had hoped for her happiness. When she finished, tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "He knew me before I was born," she whispered. "He believed I would be worthy of love." "You are," Lucian said. "You always were. I was simply too slow to see it." She rose from her chair and stepped into his arms, and he held her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, because she was. In the quiet of that room, surrounded by books and firelight and the scent of roses, the Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne began again. Not as strangers bound by duty, but as two people who had walked through pain, distance, regret, and fear, and had chosen at last to heal together. And that choice, that slow, tender, hard-won love, was worth more than any title or estate. It was worth everything.